Welcome to this edition of Cranmer Readings on July 20, 2022 at 6:30. We're talking about November 1532. Cranmer and Marguerite had met earlier that year, only a few months previously. Cranmer's responsibilities required him to travel to the emperor's court. And in summer 1532, the emperor had been in Nuremberg negotiating with Lutheran cities for his support against the Ottoman Empire. Lutheranism had developed quickly in the 15 years since Martin Luther had published his 95 Theses. Cranmer met Reverend Andreas Osiander, who wrote a small catechism and led the city of Nuremberg in its Lutheran developments, so Cranmer could see uphand what that was like. Cranmer was interested in these documents, many of which were in German, so he decided to learn German. Osiander suggested that his niece Margaret would be a good teacher. Cranmer had wrestled with his feelings. He'd taken the vow of clerical celibacy. He was 42 and she was 21. 1532. He's actually 43, going on 43. But other Protestants were married. Osiander himself, a reverend who'd taken the vow of celibacy. So he ends up marrying her. To his private surprise, she accepted his proposal. Osiander, apart from learning about Osiander's personal work, Cranmer needed to extend his knowledge of the wider Protestant movement in Germany. A difficult situation had arisen that some Protestant leaders disagreed with Luther as to what services should replace services of Catholicism. All Protestants believed in justification by faith, that faith was the only path to eternal life. On this basis, pilgrimages, worship of relics, and the commemoration of saints had no value in securing eternal life in heaven. Hence, they had no part in Protestant worship. Even good deeds were not important unless they flowed from faith. Justification by faith represented a fundamental challenge to the core belief of the Roman Catholic Church. The prime disagreement among Protestants was about the Eucharist, the church service commemorating Christ's Last Supper. All Protestants rejected the Roman Catholic belief in transubstantiation, by which the bread and wine physically became the body and blood of Christ. However, they did not agree on the detail of what should replace transubstantiation. A conference had been held in 1530 at Augsburg in Germany to try to resolve the differences. Osiander had been at this and other conferences where the main tenets of Lutheranism had been formally agreed. He'd also been at the foundation of the Protestant Schmalkaldic League in 1531, which was a military treaty. All this was grist to the mill for Cranmer and his masters in London. Osiander was a central figure in the European Protestantism. Cranmer had long-term justification to stay in contact with him on behalf of the king. In autumn 1532, the emperor and court left Nuremberg for Vienna, which was under threat from the Ottoman Empire. Cranmer was obliged to go with him. Cranmer and Marguerite had planned for this. They expected that the emperor would return to Mantua from Vienna, so had decided that Marguerite would go directly to Mantua to meet Cranmer there. A steady stream of Protestant ambassadors and merchants journeyed between Nuremberg and the emperor's court at Mantua, so it was easy for Marguerite to join one of these groups and travel in safety. The Protestant community in Mantua would look after her until Cranmer arrived. Cranmer was aware of the risks in this plan, particularly if there was a military disaster at Vienna, but he did not wish to override the confidence of his young wife that it would all work out well. And the plan did work out reasonably well. The Ottomans, under the leadership of Suleiman the Magnificent, abandoned the siege of Vienna, either out of military necessity or because it had not been a serious attack in the first place. Cranmer returned to Mantua from Vienna, although after a horrendous journey. He and Marguerite were able to settle in comfortable rooms in a peaceable piazza. No one inquired directly about their domestic arrangements, probably because many of the people who might so have inquired had their own secrets to hide. Cranmer met frequently with the emperor's officials and the Vatican representatives to argue King Henry's case for the annulment. Occasionally, he met the emperor in person. The Pope he already knew from an earlier assignment in Rome. Cranmer continued to send regular reports to the king and Cromwell, and in return received occasional instruction which did not unduly disturb his days. Cranmer continued his studies of the religious issues surrounding the authority of the Pope and his German studies. Then 2 letters arrived from London. Cranmer gently told his wife that the letters contained a summons to return to London and an appointment for him to the most senior position in the church. She realized instantly the impact of his new position and that their marriage created a real danger for him. I can't go back in Nuremberg and live very quietly so that no one in England will know that I exist. He was relieved that she was taking it so bravely. Bless you, Marguerite, for your courage. Once I get back to England and Anne Boleyn is crowned queen, we will create the English Protestant Church and remove the laws about priestly celibacy, just as Lutheran churches have done. Then you'll be able to come and join me in Canterbury. The Archbishop has 4 palaces at his disposal. Just think of that. When he put it like that, it all seemed quite straightforward. He realized that though she was not following his line of thought about 4 palaces and a multitude of servants, she did not speak for a few seconds. There's something I have to tell you. She took his hands and looked him in the eye. I am with child. I was going to wait a few more days before telling you just to make sure, but I believe it to be true. Cranmer was delighted, overcome with delight. He'd feared that he might be too old to father a child. They sat for a while in silence. He needed to absorb the news of a forthcoming baby, and she to absorb the news of his departure to England. From long habit, his thought processes were slow and considered. Marguerite thought quickly and instinctively and spoke first. You will not be here to baptize the baby. He had no response. I shall have to bring it up all alone. Again, he could not respond. You told me that your first wife died in childbirth. What if the same happens to me? What will you do then? She was thinking about him, not herself. He was still unable to reply. Then she changed direction. You told me that for your first wife, you left your college in Cambridge, took lodgings, and struggled to pay the bills. If I can be with you, I will live anywhere. I do not care if we are poor. I do not want 4 palaces. I want to be with my husband. It was true that he'd left the security of the Fellowship of Jesus College for his first marriage. over 15 years ago. Following the heartbreak of the death of his wife and child, he had fortunately been able to return to the college. In the aftermath of Luther's denunciation of the Roman Catholic Church, Cranmer had decided to study divinity and not law as many clergymen did. Her words had thrown him into a confusion of memories and hopes. He still could not get his ideas together to respond to her. She realized that and continued her persuasion. And we'll pick this up next time as we turn to Jasper Ridley and 1543. The crisis with the prebendaries. Cranmer attended the meeting of the council the next day with his ring, but found the door closed against him. This was the calculated slight to the fallen primate from the men who had kept their caps in Cromwell's presence when they met him on the morning of his arrest. For 3/4 of an hour, Cranmer was made to wait in the anteroom with the servants and suitors, while the clerks and officials walked in and out of the council chamber through the anteroom without paying attention to Cranmer. Maurice then informed Dr. Butts, the king's physician, who was very close to Henry, and like Denny, used his influence on the side of the reformers. Butts immediately joined Cranmer in the anteroom, making a public demonstration of his friendship, and then went to Henry and told him of how Cranmer was being made to wait among lackeys. But though Henry was highly indignant, he allowed events to take their course. When Cranmer came before the council, the colleagues with whom for many years he had worked and dined almost daily, informed him that he was to be sent to the Tower to answer the charge for heresy. But Cranmer appealed to the king and produced the ring. The councillors knew at once that they had gravely blundered, and Russell declared that he had said that the king would only allow them to send Cranmer to the Tower if it were a case of high treason, a statement which throws revealing light on the discussions which had been taking place and unsincerity of the accusers. The councillors went with Cranmer to the king, who upbraided them for their conduct, while Norfolk asserted that they had only wished to charge Cranmer with heresy in order to give him the opportunity for vindicating himself. And Henry ordered them to shake hands with Cranmer and warned them not to attempt to harm him again. He then ordered Cranmer to entertain the councillors to dinner. Crisis averted. Now for Eamon Duffy on Cranmer and popular religion. And Paul Eris's Cranmer, a churchman. But unlike baptism and the other sacraments, where the objects used in the ceremony were jealously guarded against lay misuse or contamination, the blessing of salt, water, and wax were intended to provide the laity with sources of power. One of the principal perks of the parish clerk consisted of holy water fees he expected when he carried supplies of holy water to every household. There it was sprinkled on the hearth to fend off evil. Ailing animals were fed blessed salt or given holy water to drink. The candles blessed in Candlemas ceremonies were lit during thunderstorms. I hope I've said enough to establish that whatever one may think of these aspects of popular religion in Tudor England, they were neither pagan nor magical in character, not quite even. Underlying these condemned usages was a complex cluster of profoundly Christian intuitions, centering on the bringing of healing and reconciliation by the proclamation of the power and name of Christ. The sacramentals were the basis for genuinely lay Christianity, for they placed in the hands of the laity sources of holy power, which were free from clerical control. Yet the uses which these sources of power were structured not by magical beliefs, but by superstitions. It was clear, though, that the reformers would have none of this. Cranmer did indeed retain a form of exorcism in the 1549 baptismal service. And I'm going to close the door here, excuse me. Excuse me for that. I apologize for the interruption. Eamon Duffy, Roman Catholic, trying to make an excuse for the superstitious practices of late medieval England. And then the canon of the Mass, he included 2 manual signs of the cross to accompany the words, "Bless and sanctify these thy gifts, creatures of bread and wine." But both these survivals of a theology, which gave a more than didactic significance to ritual gestures, horrified his Protestant advisors and critics, disappeared in the 1552 revision. The spirit and the body are contrary, Cranmer had starkly declared in the 1548 House of Lords debate on the sacrament. Sharing and carrying further Erasmus's Neoplatonic tendency to disjoin the spiritual and the material. That's a backslap. That's nonsense. He carried the day against transubstantiation and consubstantiation. He carried the day in the 4 days of debate, 14 to 18, and Duffy is just gliding over it. Cranmer and his fellow reformers could find room for sacramentals, if at all, only in didactic or as mnemonic devices. And indeed, long before Cranmer declared, or perhaps was fully conscious of his own rejection of the theology underlying popular religion and centuries of Catholic sacramental practice, his conservative critics sense in the apparently innocuous didactic justifications of the old ceremony offered by the Henrician establishment in the 1530s, the thin end of a very broad wedge. For 1535, Cranmer was filling the Diocese of Canterbury with officials and preachers who were more openly Protestant than himself, such as John Scory, Christian Nevinson, and Cranmer's own brother, Edmund, whom he made Archdeacon of Canterbury. By this date, Cranmer himself, though committed as Henry's Archbishop to defending the traditional ceremonies, albeit as teaching aids rather than focuses of power, had in fact come to believe that images, holy bread, holy water, holy days, merits, works, ceremony, and other such were fantasy, and hath these 300 or 400 years been corruptly taught. He could not say this openly, but he systematically protected lay and clerical radicals. That's a nice term. Within his diocese, these men launched a series of vitriolic attacks on the popular practices which Cranmer was officially committed to defending. "Think you," asks Scory, "that the devil will be afraid or flee away from cross-making, hurling of holy water, ringing of bells, and such other ceremonies, when he was not afraid to take Christ on himself and cast on him on his back and set him on a pinnacle?" We'll pick up Eamon's efforts. later. Now with Leslie Williams and the danger in the 1540s emblem of faith untouched. Nice little um, quick. It's the kind of thing I would give to someone beginning their maiden voyage in the studies on Cranmer. And for those who are longer, those of us who are longer in the reading on Cranmer, it's a good, quick pull it all together. Well, Cromwell's lost his head. The same day, he gets married to Katie Howard, who turns out to be a lynx, and Cranmer's facing danger. The same day that both his 1540 Houses of Parliament passed the nullity decree on Anne Cleves, they also mandated the death penalty for married priests under the 6 Articles. Though Henry knew about Cranmer's wife, he kept his counsel and allowed him to keep her. As long as Cranmer kept Margaret either out there in the country and out of sight, no scandal would erupt because the act was not retroactive. Henry's gesture offered the only consolation prize to Cranmer in that dreary summer of 1540. After the pilgrimage of grace, the king had gathered selected advisors around him, calling these members his privy council. When Cromwell was deposed and executed 28 July, the leading nobles gave this body official status with a constitution and a secretary to take minutes, most likely to prevent a single person like Wolsey or Cromwell from gaining precedence. Cranmer was the first in the list of precedents, and William Paget was named council clerk. He'll turn his back on his patron, Wiley Winchester. That's another story. In the meantime, Henry's marital adventures plunge forward with the compelling nature of a popular reality television show. That's about it. It's a sideshow. Philip of Hesse in Germany married bigamously, we might add, with Luther's support. So Henry wasn't the only matrimonial scandal that year. Henry had unloaded wife number 4 and wed number 5 in the summer of 1540. But his new marital happiness would be short-lived, 15 months. Along with the usual problems of disparate worldviews in winter-spring marriage, Henry had grown fat and moody. He had a 58-inch waist. Catherine loved the clothes, glamour, party atmosphere of being a queen, but she missed her circle. We had a power outage here for a moment. Her circle of young, attractive men who flitted in and out of her chambers. She invited them back and participated in a suicidally rash sexual liaisons behind Henry's back. You know, her head's going to roll. When they were touring, especially in the north of England, in the royal procession during the summer and fall of 1541. The court could look the only way only for so long. Finally, a minor courtier, John Lascelles, came to Cranmer, who was serving with Lord Chancellor Thomas Audley and Edmund Seymour, Earl of Hertford, and as managers of the King's Privy Council, called the Caretaker Council. While Henry and Catherine were away, he reported that his sister Mary had told him of Catherine's impropriety with Catherine's lute player Mannix and courtier named Durham, when Mary had lived with her at the Duchess of Norfolk's house. Cranmer put the quietus on the story, but held the meeting with Audley and Seymour. Henry must be told, but how and by whom? Cranmer drew the black bean had the best odds of surviving the miserable and potentially deadly task of presenting the king with the bad news. But even Cranmer, with all his diplomacy intact, couldn't face Henry in person. So that story goes. And now the background on the affairs on the continent. In February 1555, the imperial diet met at Augsburg and under the presidency of the emperor's brother Ferdinand ratified the toleration of Passo by the Peace of Augsburg. The settlement then prevailed for half a century, and such hopes as Charles may have hitherto maintained of passing on the imperial crown to Philip disappeared. It was clear that Germany would not endure a Spanish domination. The star of Charles was not in the ascendant. Julius was succeeded in the same year by Cardinal Carafa, a fiery and austere zealot whose personal animosity for the Habsburgs was increased by the Augsburg succession of the Protestants. In February of the following year, Charles resigned the crown of Spain to Philip, retired from active political life, and died in the year which saw Elizabeth ascend to the throne, 1559. The final stage of the Council of Trent was not reached until 1563, when another pope was reigning, who'd followed Pope Paul IV in 1559, where there came about that union of Spain, Rome, and the Jesuits, which forced England to consolidate herself once more into a power that was to grapple with Spain in the New World and to shatter the invincible Armada. Turn now to Prof. Mac in the post-Cromwellian period. The Committee on Doctrine seems to have done the bulk of its work after Cromwell's fall. This is suggested by two different stories, one recorded by Ralph Maurice and the other by John Fox. Maurice speaks of Cranmer finding out when Cromwell was in the Tower that the whole rabblement, which he took to be his friends, being commissioners with him, deserted him for Gardiner's side. He names Bishop Heath and Shaxton and Thirlby, whom he points out were chiefly advanced and preserved unto their dignities by Cranmer, but also all the other meaner sort. Fox, in a passage which owes something to the anecdote, and which probably relies on further information from Maurice for their material, names Heath and Skip, having him down from the rest of the commissioners into his garden at Lambeth, and Cranmer fiercely and effectively resisting their persuasions. Both stories are significant in indicating the moment at which Cranmer's old friends and formerly enthusiastic evangelical fellow travelers, Hurth and Thirlby, began going back down the road to traditional Romanism, which brought them in the end to Queen Mary's episcopal bench instead of sharing the archbishop's imprisonment and death. The doctrinal committee seems to have worked within the framework formed by 17 sets of questions on doctrine. An enigmatic reference preserved by John Scrip to Cromwell having visited the Convocation of Canterbury on 5 May to expound certain articles should perhaps be interpreted as referring to these questions. One set of answers to the questions forms a possible exception, a note of individual opinions within it. For instance, reveals the argument over the necessity of auricular confession on scriptural authority, with Skip, Heath, and Thirlby still at that stage supporting Cranmer against the Conservative Party. So here we may have survivals from an early stage in the wrangling before the desertions of which Maurice and Fox speak. It may also be significant that unlike all the other surviving documents, these papers include the name Bishop Gardiner, who left for his embassy abroad on November 15. The other notable feature is their collection of marginalia from King Henry in truculent reformist mode, questioning the scriptural origins of confirmation, unction, and chrism, challenging the exclusive right of bishops to ordain clergy, and wanting proof for the origins of their office. And we'll bring this to a close. Glory be to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end.